The tagline for this video is something to the tune of Gaito Gazdanov was my greatest joy and my greatest disappointment. Let's explore why that is. When I talk about classical literature, I always start with a brief recap for the author's biography. It can be more or less relevant for the book that I'm reviewing, but in the case of Gaito Gazdanov, it is very much relevant, and you cannot understand his books without it. Well, that's an overstatement. Obviously, you can read the books without. It's just that his prose is so infused with autobiographical bits that it gets closer to autofiction rather than regular fiction, although we will treat it still as regular fiction. So let's look at who Gazdanov was and see what bits of his own story made it into his books. Gaito Gazdanov was born 6th of December 1902 in St. Petersburg. The family was of Ossetian origin. The father was a forest ranger, so they had to travel a lot to Siberia, Central Russia, and East Ukrainian parts. Thus, Gazdanov's education was a little bit sporadic. He didn't even finish his schooling in gymnasium before the war broke out. At 16 years old, Gazdanov joined the volunteer army, and thus the White Army, but not for ideological reasons like it was for many. No, he wanted to understand what war was, and he only chose the White Army because they were the losing side, since joining the winning side seemed immoral. Thus, he spent about a year fighting on an armored train, and he retreated along with the White Army to Crimea, from where he took the fabled and famous boat to Constantinople, the very same boat that all of the Russian immigration seems to have taken to escape Russia, like Nabokov escaped Russia the same route. As you can see, Gazdanov ended up in immigration a very young man without any connections or work experience, and so after a few years on the road, he settled in Paris 1923. And when I mean settled, it just means that he took any job possible just to make ends meet. He was a mover, a train washer, a factory worker, all of these jobs that didn't pay all that well, so he even spent nights in the streets from time to time. Somewhat a stable occupation for him became a taxi driver that allowed some sort of normal living. He even attended some classes at the Sorbonne, and he also started writing. His debut novel, Evening with Claire, came out 1929 and was highly praised by both Ivan Bunin and Maxim Gorky, but he only managed to leave off his writing with the Spectre Alexander Wolf, the novel that came out 1947. Gazdanov made some attempts at returning to Russia. He even requested Gorky's assistance, but was unsuccessful. But then he met his wife, Faina, and they settled in Paris finally, and became French citizens after the war. During World War II, he and Faina joined the French Resistance, and they were part of the partisans unit in France. That part of his life is reflected in his book, Je m'engage à défendre. Starting in 1953, Gazdanov started working at Radio Liberty under a pseudonym Georgy Cherkasov, where he talked about Russian literature. A fun fact, Gazdanov was also part of the Freemasons, starting from 1930s. He even made it up the ladder, the hierarchy in that order. He became like Mason Lodge officer or something. 1970, Gazdanov got diagnosed with lung cancer, and he passed away in 1971. He's now buried at Sainte-Geneviève-de-Bois cemetery near Paris. In Russia, Gazdanov was more or less unknown until the 1990s, where he had a brief boom in popularity, but to this day he remains one of the lesser-known authors of the Russian immigration. So, as I said, Gazdanov became my greatest joy and my greatest hope and my greatest disappointment, and let's finally talk about why. I picked up Evening with Claire without any knowledge of who Gazdanov was, and I read it in one sitting, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It flowed really nicely in this stream of consciousness way, so effortless and so engaging, and it was really beautiful Russian language. It made me so excited. It felt like I found my new favorite author. I picked up Evening with Claire with the intention of making this video, but it felt a little bit lean, like there is not much that I could say about it to make a full video on it, so I was like, okay, fine, that's fine, let's read something else, like Night Roads. It's a longer novel of his, and there's bound to be more to talk about. Oh boy. It followed quite nicely, but I got this weird feeling about the subject matter. The further I got, the more explicit and obvious the theme became, until it was almost written out like a thesis statement. I was like, no, please no. Because the theme and this idea was so abhorrent that I couldn't believe it. I even instantly went to a podcast that I sometimes listen to. One of the women on there, I trust to have like sound opinions, and thank devil she had the same issue with this book and seemingly Gazdanov in general. So I was at least relieved that I didn't misread the text completely. It just made me sad at that point. But at the same time, I was not done with Gazdanov just yet. It felt like he had more to say, so I decided to give him another chance, especially since the Spectre of Alexander Wolff seems to be a completely different genre almost, leaning into like suspense and detective stories maybe. So I read that one as well. And it was fine. I found the ending a little bit confusing and maybe a little bit forced, but it was perfectly fine. At least it didn't have that abhorrent theme from Night Roads. So here I am with 3 books that I can talk to you about. So let's just have a conversation without doing a full recap like I normally do. But spoiler warning does apply, even though I really want you to read these books for yourself first. As I said already, Gazdanov's books have these autobiographical bits in them without them actually becoming autofiction. A thing you will notice in all of these books, well, the 3 that I've read, is that they're all written in the first-person POV. The main character doesn't have a name, but he has a lot of similarities with Gazdanov. So I don't want to call the character Gazdanov. I don't think that's the angle we need to take here. However, keep in mind, as we talk specific plot details and plot bits, that they are very much rooted in Gazdanov's own life. Most likely. So let's talk Evening with Claire first. The protagonist goes to see his beloved Claire, from whom he's been separated for 10 years almost. And as he lays there that night with her on his arm, he starts reflecting on the past that actually led him to her, starting all the way from his childhood through his father's passing, his time at school, his first meeting with Claire, then his service on the armored train, and his escape from Russia and arrival in Paris, where he hoped to meet Claire once again. The entire novel, and it's only about 100 pages, is written in this stream of consciousness way that made critics compare Gazdanov to Marcel Proust. One memory triggers another, they flow one into the other, interspersed with like philosophical ponderings, but it all flows quite smoothly and it feels organic. That's probably what made me really fall in love with this particular novel, how easy it is to read because of this particular style and not because it's simple or something like that. There is a cadence to his prose, even a certain musicality, if you will, that carries you from page 1 to 100. It also allows Gazdanov to switch from memories into philosophical ponderings and then dip back again into the memories, and it feels very much smooth and unbroken. Thematically, it has a few things going on. The obvious frame is this meeting with Claire that the protagonist hoped for from the moment they got separated. The epigraph to the novel is a quote from Pushkin, "My life has been a precondition to our encounter, which I crave," which actually puts this meeting with Claire, their union, as the protagonist's sole objective, but also the lens through which he views his life. Like all of these hardships and problems that he had to endure, they led him to her, and thus they became bearable. But his life becomes more colorful for it, and the reason is Claire. Jumping slightly ahead, the Paris that we see in Evenings with Claire is so different from the one that we see in Night Roads, and the reason is Claire, because the protagonist finds her and has her, while the guy from Rhodes only has a portrait of some lady. I've listened to a lecture where a professor argued that the existence of Claire, or even the very idea of her, is the true key to happiness. I maybe wouldn't go that far, but for sure it is the most important key to understanding the novel. The love interests in Gazdanov novels are these women who are a little bit hard to get, a little cold, a little distant, most likely based on the same woman whom Gazdanov known back in Russia, but whom he never actually found in Paris, while he granted his fictional counterpart that mercy of finding his Claire. Claire is somewhat similar to the love interest from the Spectre Alexander Wolff, but as I'm writing this here and I'm talking about it, it may be the Spectre woman, she's modeled more after Gazdanov's wife? I don't know. But she has that same cold distance to her that the hero from Spectre doesn't even understand what attracted him to her in the first place. And it's the same thing with Claire. I don't want to call her bitchy, but she is a very attractive woman, and she uses this attraction that the men feel for her to play with them, and it's not always nice. And the young character, just like Gazdanov did, they fell for it. They crave her attention at all costs, and she knows that too. And I think in female spheres, we kind of side-eye that behavior from women. But at least the hero gets her in the end, so I guess that's happy ending. Other themes are somewhat universal to Gazdanov's works, like, for example, the motif of death that we'll see explored more in The Spectre of Alexander Wolff. There is the theme from Night Roads that I hate. It rears its ugly head here, but we will talk more on it when we talk Night Roads. Then there is this theme of traveling and wandering, first in the childhood stories of the protagonist, then on the armored train. But it's also this idea of leaving one's country and spending years on the road trying to find a new home elsewhere. But the central theme is actually that of duality, as the protagonist lives in these two different worlds, the actual real world and the world of his ideas, imagination, and higher ideals. This theme creeps up in all three books, but it's most prominent here in a very straightforward way. It's going to be more allegorical and yet explicit in The Spectre of Alexander Wolff. As the character here in Evening with Claire, he has these dissociative episodes almost that he inherits from his mother, the mother who loved to read and could completely zone out for hours having finished one book. Gazdanov separates the real world, where you need to take care of your baser needs like food and shelter, from that world of thoughts and ideas. He obviously prioritizes this higher plane of existence and is actually quite annoyed when baser needs show their face. And a lot of this book is about that clash, because for most people, they need to spend time working instead of these philosophical ponderings, but for Gazdanov, that's the only thing that matters. It's slightly idealistic here, this idea that you can dedicate all of your time to these ideas and philosophical ponderings while completely disregarding the world outside, but it's an interesting thought experiment at the very least. This theme of duality takes a slightly different shape in The Spectre of Alexander Wolff. This novel is written with a great deal of suspense. The plot is that the protagonist, back in Russia during the Civil War, he shot a man in a field. And years later in Paris, he encounters a book that describes that very same event, but from the point of view of that man that he supposedly killed. So the protagonist understands that the man is very much alive, and he's called Alexander Wolff. Eventually, they even get to meet and discuss that very event and the idea of death itself. Wolff seems to carry a lot of resentment towards our protagonist. Over the course of the story, the protagonist also meets his love interest at a boxing match, and we soon realize that she's also connected to Alexander Wolff. I'm not actually going to tell you how the story ends, because it's a huge spoiler, and I think you might enjoy reading it for yourself. Even from this brief recap, you can already see the same themes creep up: the duality, the death, and love. The duality in this particular case takes a mirror-like shape. Wolff and the protagonist are reflections of one another. The events tend to repeat. Their role in the love interest Yelena's life, they're all kind of reflections of one another. The most obvious event is the death of Wolff back in Russia. It's written from both POVs. It's actually an interesting move from Gazdanov, a very interesting read. Actually, also pay attention to the way that Gazdanov works with structure, composition, and the events that he brings in. Like, for example, the boxing match where the protagonist meets Yelena for the first time. It felt like a very weird scene for a while. It's described in great detail, but then one of the boxers says a phrase that snaps the scene into sharp focus as a reflection of the confrontation with Wolff, and then it all makes sense. The entire novel is also bookended with mirrored scenes, so look out for that. The duality between the protagonist and Wolff comes to its ideological fruition at their meeting, where they actually discussed their first ill-timed meeting when they shot at each other. There is obvious tension. Wolff appears to be more hostile, the protagonist more inquisitive and curious, but the main point is their different views on death. I, among other things, am not at all afraid of death. Rather, life has never appeared to be particularly valuable to me. And yet, it's the only valuable thing that we get to experience. This exchange is at the crux of their difference. Wolff values his life above all else, while the protagonist treats death as simply the next step in his journey. Part of it has to do with the dissociation that this character is also prone to. Like, there is nothing for him to cherish on this mortal plane, and supposedly the higher plane would continue even after death. It was nevertheless an interesting back and forth between him and Woolf, and an honest conversation on the morality of murder that I found more interesting than anything that I saw in Dostoevsky, who was also obsessed with the topic. This philosophical discussion, along with the suspenseful nature of the Spectre Alexander Woolf, make this book into one of the more interesting pieces by Gazdanov, even though I have my issues with it. Like structurally, for example, there is a scene at the very end that is both set up and paid off right then and there, while it could have been easily set up earlier than that, but I digress. If you're looking for a more plot-driven story, this is probably the one for you. Evening with Claire and Night Roads are more introspective rather than plot-driven. One more thing to mention before we move on to Night Roads, and it has to do with a love story. Russian classical literature is very chaste. Even as you move into the 20th century, it's still not even suggested that the characters do anything more than hand-holding, not even the blasted fade to black before things get really interesting. Gazdanov breaks that mold a little bit here. There's nothing explicit, necessarily, but there is something erotic about the way that he writes the reactions of his protagonist to the love interest. At one point, the hero notices Yelena's knees and has to think of the wide blue sea to calm down. Or in Evening with Claire, Claire wants to put her head in his lap and he needs to run out of the room not to embarrass himself, something that Claire teases him for. I think it's an honest depiction of those scenes without going overboard, so I enjoyed it. And finally, we get to Night Roads. This is probably the most autobiographical of the novels, and it depicts the life of the protagonist, who's a taxi driver in Paris. The night Paris that he describes is absolutely repulsive. No matter who he's driving, it's going to be the scum of the earth, whether it's the prostitutes, the pimps, and the drunks that he keeps company with, or the high society, like a wealthy woman who steals a brooch left by the previous passenger, or a priest that he takes to all of the brothels in town. The tapestry of these characters paints a very unflattering picture of Night Paris, so different from the one that we've seen in Evening with Claire, which was all glitz and glamour, or even the one from the Spectre Alexander Woolf, where we also got to meet the criminal underbelly of Paris, but never to this extent. It's probably not the most representative sample that the protagonist or Gazdanov get when they work nights. That's when the human nature is at its lowest, but it's also the company that he keeps. There are some recurring characters at the bar that he frequents, like his friend Plato, with whom he likes to discuss the eternal, but only before Plato gets too drunk, otherwise you cannot get anything out of him. Or the hookers and their clientele, like the higher echelon prostitute called Breldi, or even the Russian immigrants who are also doing these manual labor jobs, like the factory worker Fedorchenko. There are some plot points that happen with these characters, like Graldi finding a beautiful young woman called Alice and trying to train her to become her replacement, and Alice abandoning her as soon as she possibly can, leaving Raldi in the dust. That leaves Raldi to die penniless, but Alice doesn't find much success either, because beyond her beauty, she doesn't have much else. Or Fedorchenko, for example, who marries a prostitute without knowing it. The girl Suzanne, she's actually quite proud that she can also bring some money into the household by doing what she's doing. But then Fedorchenko falls in with a man called Vasiliev, who is a conspiracy theorist who believes that everybody's following him. Vasiliev then dies under mysterious circumstances, by the way. And our main character simply watches them with a mixture of pity and disgust. Because you see, the protagonist, he's not like them. He has to work the same awful jobs. He met Fedorchenko working at the same factory. He drives a taxi, also not the most prestigious of jobs. But he doesn't drink. He only drinks milk. He doesn't sleep with these women of the night. He even rejects Alice, the most beautiful woman he's seen in a while. He reads books. He goes to the cinema. Plato is only his friend because they can talk about philosophy and such. Thus, the protagonist holds himself above the company that he keeps, because after all, taxi driving is a means to an end. His actual purpose lies in different things, higher things, up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like self-actualization. And honestly, it wouldn't be such a terrible motif to have, that even in the direst of straits, we shouldn't lose our humanity. We should strive for better things. We should think about morality, about bettering ourselves. We should ask ourselves these important questions of life and death, of eternal and all of that. But the problem here is that not only is it a point of pride for Gazdanov that he does all that he is so different, he's not like other girls, that he's more intelligent, more aware, more virtuous, more everything, while other people are simply stupid. That's already not a defensible position, lifting yourself up by pushing others down, but it gets worse. He also believes that these people that he meets, they are physically and psychologically incapable of doing what Gazdanov is doing, and if they attempt to break the barriers of their class and their position, they die. It's demonstrated in Fedorchenko, who actually manages to accumulate some wealth and thus rises above his station, but he soon starts questioning things. He asks himself big questions. I want to know. I want you to explain it to me. First of all, why do I exist in the world? Secondly, what will happen to me when I die? And if nothing happens, then why the hell everything else? What exactly? Everything. Government, science, politics, Suzanne, commerce, music, especially music. And why is the sky overhead? And why everything at all? Surely it cannot be that everything was in vain. I do not know what to answer you. He tries to discuss Nietzsche, the matters of life and death, the need for politics, economics, and all of these sciences. But since he's only done manual labor up to this point, these questions become insurmountable. And the author concludes that the answers to these questions, or at least peace with their unanswerability, become unattainable for a man like that. The questions that he couldn't get rid of and the answers that seemed so necessary to him that it wasn't worth living without, all these questions had been familiar to me for a very long time, and as I slowly and gradually got used to their tragic insolubility, I developed a kind of immunity against them. Fedorchenko was defenseless. It seemed to me that I was witnessing some cruel and imaginary experience, that I was witnessing the futile struggle of the body against a rapidly spreading disease that it could not overcome. So Fedorchenko crumbles under their weight and hangs himself on the doorknob. I still don't know how he'd done it, but that's what happens. But look at what the author concludes then. This was especially unbearable for him because by nature he belonged to that category of people for whom the logical constructions are the maximum of their mental achievements, and for whom the existence of irrational things is unacceptable. The podcast that I listened to called it social Darwinism, and yes, it is very much that, but at the core, it's such a level of ignorance and snobbery that it made me choke on it. The crossing of class divides is impossible for these people, since their simple brains cannot handle it, while we, the people of intellectual labor, will look down on them and use the products of their labor, but please do not come close, because ew. Gazdanov constantly feels this mixture of disdain, disgust, and pity for these people for whom he carries no more regard than ants, because that's what they are to him. Worms, leeches, only focused on feeding their belly and satisfying their baser needs, while he's over here thinking of the eternal. But to even suggest that they might start thinking about such things once their baser needs are satisfied, well, no, it's impossible. Their little brains cannot handle it. Conversely, the mobility the other way around works effortlessly, because Gazdanov also criticizes the Russian aristocrats and immigrants in general who've come here and are doing this manual labor but not do anything to keep up their high status of intellectualism. Like, what the dude? I understand that Maslow came up with his hierarchy a little bit later, but have you no decency? It looks like these deep thoughts that you are so proud of didn't teach you shit now, did they? I don't need to tell you that such levels of pride and snobbery are not the way to go. It simply caught me off guard. I don't think I've seen it displayed so bluntly before. Gazdanov is often compared to Nabokov, and that dude is prideful as hell as well, but at least he hides it. Like, what the hell is going on, Gaito? I've said that glimpses of this intellectual superiority that Gazdanov is so proud of, it's in all of his books, but it is at least subtext there. Here, it rises to the level of text. And it made me so disgusted that I barely finished the book. There are still ways of writing about people like that, even if you have no regard for them. You can still write it with compassion. They are still people. Some doing their best, some failing spectacularly, some sinful, some not, some smart, some less so, but they're still people. So for you to come in and to say that the situation that they ended up in defines them and that they're not capable of more by nature, no, I cannot stand for that. I don't want to find excuses for Gazdanov here. I probably could have gone harder. It's just that I've also seen reviews that completely downplay this angle and go for the more sympathetic view of Gazdanov. Like Gazdanov is simply keeping his ground in the face of the circumstances, surrounded by these vagabonds and lowlifes, and he's still staying true to his beliefs. And yes, that might be true, but at what cost? And with what emotion? Gazdanov is indeed a great love and a great disappointment for me, because I genuinely loved his prose. I loved his language, I loved the themes and plots he's chosen, but this one thing completely ruined it for me. Because as I said, I've reread Evening with Claire after Night Roads, and that theme is also there. Hidden, but it's there. So it's actually what Gazdanov believes. Having said that, I do want you to read Evening with Claire. It's short, it's sweet, it's nice, and it's also not something that I've seen in Russian literature before, so there is that. I think you might enjoy it.